Welcome to the Future Christian Podcast, your source for insights and ideas on how to lead your church in the 21st century. At the Future Christian Podcast, we talk to pastors, authors, and other faith leaders for helpful advice and practical wisdom to help you and your community of faith walk boldly into the future. Whether you're a pastor, church leader, or a passionate member of your faith community, this podcast is designed to challenge, inspire, and equip you with the tools you need for impactful ministry. And now for a little bit about the guest for this episode.
Welcome to the Future Christian Podcast. Today, Loren Richmond Jr. is in conversation with Gerardo Marti and Mark T. Mulder. Gerardo is the William R. Kennan Jr. Professor of Sociology at Davidson College and President of the Society for the Scientific Study of Religion. A prolific and award-winning author, his research explores religious innovation and the role of religion in shaping patterns of racialization and political engagement in the United States. Mark's research focuses on urban congregations and changing racial ethnic demographics. Mulder is professor of sociology at Calvin University and director of the Common Good Collective. He is the author or co-author of 5 books. In addition, Mulder has published numerous peer-reviewed articles in academic journals, including Social Problems, Religion and American Culture, and the Journal of Urban History. He has also published pieces for church audiences and won writing awards from the Evangelical Press Association and the Associated Church Press. A reminder before we start today's conversation, please take a moment to subscribe to the podcast, leave a review, and share Future Christian with a friend. Connect with Loren, Martha, and Future Christian on Instagram. Shoot us an email at loren@resonatemediapro.com with comments, questions, or ideas for future episodes. We appreciate your voice in how we faithfully discern the future of the church.
Okay, welcome to the Future Christian Podcast. This is Loren Richmond Jr. I'm pleased to be joined today by Dr. Mark Mulder and Dr. Gerardo Marti. Thank you both for your time and looking forward to this conversation. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Yeah, so looking forward to having this conversation. Let's start with you, Mark. Anything else you want listeners to know about you?
I'm also a dad and a husband and a bike rider, and I've been president of my neighborhood association in the core city of Grand Rapids, Michigan, for a number of years in the past.
Yeah, great. That can be the real controversial work, I can imagine. HOAs? Is it an HOAs or just a neighborhood association?
No. Professors can't afford. This is a good old fashioned urban neighborhood.
Fair enough. Probably less drama that way. Gerardo, how about you?
Born on the East Coast, moved to the West Coast, married a woman from the Midwest, and have been working in the South for decades now. So I feel that I've had the good fortune of experiencing a lot of life, a lot of religious life, and most of my work has focused on changing religious dynamic, religious innovations, as well as congregations. And in between that, I'm a dad, I'm a grandfather, I have other commitments, and I love to read.
Yeah, awesome. Well, I love to read too, and that's kind of why we're having this conversation today. So we're here to talk about the book that Mark and Gerardo authored, The Church Must Grow or Perish, Robert Schuller and the Business of American Christianity. I was really glad. I can't remember if I found this on Erdman's or they sent it to me, but I was really excited to read this, and I was not disappointed. So let's start with this for the conversation. What was the driving idea or question that y'all had when you sat down to write this book? Mark, do you want to start with that?
I'd love to. So I think Gerardo and I started having conversations about this roughly a decade ago. We were just past the 10-year mark of Schuller's passing. He died quite quietly in April of 2015. And Gerardo and I had been working on a different project together for a while. And I'm going to give Gerardo the credit. This was his idea. He had grown up in the shadow of the Crystal Cathedral. And I think we were both struck by the fact that Robert Schuller, who had been this, at one point, I think you could have made the argument that the Crystal Cathedral was perhaps the most recognized congregation or church in the world, if not just the United States, and had he was someone I remember from seeing on Hour of Power on Sunday mornings when I was homesick from church, and for him to kind of quietly pass without much fanfare or discussion, I think struck us. Well, there's a story there, a narrative, and I think we really felt like Schuller his influence was being underestimated. And we wanted to address that and try to see what we could explain about his ministry and what it could tell us about late 20th century, early 21st century religion in the United States.
Yeah. Thanks for sharing that. I was struck just by how, even you mentioned watching the Hour of Power. Like, I remember growing up, I grew up Independent Baptist. My dad was a pastor. When he wasn't a pastor, I was going to church every Sunday. Mm-hmm. Yet even I remember somehow watching, even here and there, the Hour of Power. Mm-hmm. So it speaks to the kind of the cultural significance it had. Like, this would have been for me probably in the late 90s. Gerardo, like, was the 80s, 90s, was that kind of like the pinnacle of the Crystal Cathedral and Schuller's ministry in some ways?
Well, absolutely. I think part of connecting with Mark was not only were Mark and I getting along well and we were doing some work. I think part of it is that Schuller's story was so big, I never felt that telling Schuller's story could be done alone or just from one person. And so having grown up in Southern California and seen various phases of the cathedral and the ministry before, it was definitely an unignorable reality in the area. Not only did pastors and Christians, so to speak, know about it, but it was a phenomenon of Southern California in a culture where there were a lot of changes and a lot of big things were occurring, big things that people had to see or experience or were seen advertised or evident on local television and in local news. So from that standpoint, we also knew that there were people coming from across the country and even across the world that were seeing Schuller's ministry as a stopping point. It was more than just a tourist destination. It was somehow seen as a guide or a model. And so once I understood even better, as Mark and I were talking about these things, that the tradition that Schuller came from was something that Mark knew and was associated with in his own way, the familial and ethnic backgrounds, also that Schuller had spent much of his formative experience in Michigan and the kind of connections. Then I got very excited because there was a sense that there was a real bigger aspect of what was going on in the shaping, not only of Robert Schuller, but therefore of American Christianity. And when you combine with the sensibilities that Mark has built over time of working with archives and digging into memos and photos and writings that I don't think anyone has looked at, this treasure trove of deep background material that other people had ignored, that's what was being brought to light. So that initiated us to write a book that focused first on how the massive enterprise of Crystal Cathedral Ministries crumbled seemingly overnight. Yeah. And that became our first project together on the ministry, the Glass Church. But there was so much left over that was biographically interesting, just understanding this person, that I approached a publisher who was open to looking at things, Erdman's, with their Library of Religious Biography, and said, we've got a lot here. would you be interested in Schuller's story? And they were willing to snatch that up. So we did this project, the one that we're talking about now, this biography, is a very unexpected project. It grew out of the overflow of this life and the massive material that was available to be able to tell an intriguing story that we thought was not only telling of Schuller's life himself, but something about the world of Christianity that we live in today.
It is. That's one of the most things that was fascinating to me just reading the book was his upbringing, very rural, Christian Reformed Church, CRC, and how starkly different Crystal Cathedral came to be. You mentioned a couple things there just in your statement about the change and how California was, these are my words, but kind of like the breeding grounds, if you will, of these new innovations. And I think that's what struck me about the title, the church must grow or perish. I'm curious, you're welcome to start with this, Gerardo and Mark, if you want to chip in here too, but in what ways was Schuller's diagnosis of the American church's decline accurate or prophetic in a way?
Well, first, a small correction that it was the Reformed Church of America, the Dutch Reformed Church of America.
I'm thinking of a friend I know who's
Right.
CRC.
That's right. Well, Mark can give more of that background, but certainly is the oldest denomination in America, and also one that had these deep roots in these ethnic enclaves. So the idea of church persisting, and even the question that a church would not exist in a community, is just not something that Schuller or his Dutch community ever imagined. So I think that once Schuller then moved out of that, went to seminary, and began to see this broader environment where there were other churches, my gosh, Lutherans and Methodists and, and then there were these other places and all these people who may not have Christianity right. Were they really Christian? Was in and of itself a question. And then the unquestioned power and authority of a pastor, which is something that he, was imbued with, but then questioning who listens to that authority and is that authority going to remain? So the boldness by which he went to a successful ministry in Illinois, he actually did exactly what his parents or his community or his upbringing would have expected. But then to launch out to something new in California is the unexpected part of it. And Mark, maybe you can continue with how you see this and how we've kind of figured some things out here.
Yeah. So, part of the story is that he was disenchanted with his inability to make more money.
True.
One of the breaking points with his first church in the south side suburbs of Chicago was he had grown it 10 times. I think it was in the less than 100, and it was over 400 within 5 years members. And I can say it because I'm Dutch myself. The cheap Dutch folks weren't willing to pay him anymore, and so when the denomination, the RCA, asked him to plant a church in California, I think he initially probably was hesitant, but then threw himself into it, and he just happened to, pick symbolically the perfect spot to try innovative worship in California when, he was very honest that it was the drive-in movie theater where he planted his church in Orange, California, was the 10th out of 10 options. He couldn't get into a school. The Presbyterians had rented the funeral home. There was no place to put up a tent. And so this became last resort. And what he did not realize was how that was going to map so perfectly onto the automobile-centric nature of Southern California in particular, and eventually the suburban United States writ large. It would be, it was all automobile-centric. And so he found a way to blend the innovation of the West Coast in California and worshiping in a new way, but he still had a lot of the hallmarks of his mainline Protestant traditional worship service that he grew up with. And so it's really interesting. He figured out a way to baptize babies in cars, to pass communion elements in cars, to hand out bulletins. And all these rituals got changed and modified. But it resonated with the folks who are migrating along Route 66 with him from the same, from Iowa, from Michigan, from Arkansas, Oklahoma, who also, these are the folks who are migrating. So they're searching for things. So they're a little more adventurous than the people who stayed behind, but they still have the residue of traditional Christianity. And so they want to see some of those hallmarks. And he delivered that, in a setting that was, exciting.
Mm-hmm. And Loren, your note on decline, his emphasis didn't begin with seeing decline. His emphasis began with the fact that he entered into an atmosphere where there weren't very many people from his own denomination. So it was a very religious, very Christian, the people who came, but they seemed to be now competing with each other to be able to attract people. And therefore, is denomination going to be the attraction for people? Is it going to be going back to something that you already know, or are you going to be willing to open yourself to a place that is still Christian, but is going to open itself to a broader sense of community? So Schuller's intentional decision to call it a community church was in itself an innovation. To not name it a denomination, because where were people going to come from, and who the heck are Dutch Reformed, right? But to be able to do that then initiated a sense of the competition that I think became very characteristic of the era. And that then implied that you were going to compete with people who weren't a part of a church right now, have some Christian sensibility, but were not necessarily loyal to a church. And I think that then starts to speak to people, or speak to a strategy that says maybe we can attract people who actually aren't connected to any church and have never been connected to any church at all.
This is something that really fascinates me, and I'm curious how you've come to think about, like, how much of his strategy was intentional? Because certainly, I think you all mentioned, right, him going door to door in Chicago, if I remember correctly, even door to door in California, and asking people if you're involved with a church. How much of it was it just like accidental? Like you mentioned, being in California where people are displaced and, somewhat obviously, or I guess quite literally in some ways, like pulled away from their traditions and roots, looking for something new, like, the automobile industry, like all that. Mark, what do you think on that?
I want to give him some credit because he was tapping into a zeitgeist. He had read, you rightly mentioned about him going door to door, and he has an anecdote about seeing Norman Vincent Peale's The Power of Positive Thinking on so many coffee tables. And he said, okay, and this was a guy who he had been, was a fellow RCA pastor in New York City who he had seen as a seminarian and came back and made fun of him in the seminary apartments because he thought it was just a joke. And he was embarrassed to have Norman Vincent Peale as another pastor in the RCA. But he realized, okay, that something's going on here. Peale is attractive to people for some reason, and so he is. There's a real intentionality about picking up some of the positive thinking, changing it into possibility thinking, coming up with a theology of self-esteem, which he thought literally was going to start the Second Reformation when he published that book. And so I think there is a lot of intentionality, a lot of puzzling that he's working on and that he was intuitive about. Even his methods in church growth, the other guys at Fuller Seminary who had systems in place and structures for how they wanted to do church growth, kind of marveled at the way that Schuller kind of intuited the things that they had been testing. And so he had a knack for being in the right place at the right time, but I think he also deserves quite a bit of credit for the way that he worked hard to figure out a way to do this in a way that is going to appeal to a large swath of the Southern California population, but then
Yeah.
eventually, as it's beamed into people's televisions across the country, and then eventually across the world, right? He's the first religious
Amazing.
broadcaster of the Soviet Union. And so that stuff is not lucky. Like, he's negotiating things,
Right.
and he's figuring out systems himself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I think this is something that strikes me as like how he kept having his building programs was, for instance, something that struck me as visionary and forward thinking and a way to keep driving inspiration and interest and forward thinking, but also struck me as something that I think seems to be, at least from my perspective, like a deeper flaw in this model of, what, if I understand the story correctly, what ultimately ruined the Crystal Cathedral was like debt, like massive debt and bankruptcy. Gerardo, do you want to talk about this almost capitalism driven model and, the strengths and weaknesses of his approach?
Well, let's start with, first of all, his belief that whatever the traditional model or normal model of doing church was, he believed it wouldn't fit the world as it was today.
Yeah, good point.
There's a market-centered society. You cannot just simply rely on momentum of tradition. You can't just decide to do the same things over and over again and assume that people are going to respond. So he concluded that, and he certainly wasn't the only one to conclude that, right?
Mm-hmm.
So from that standpoint, once you accept that he was a very, very committed person in relation to the church. He was so committed that the church should exist and that the church should actually be a building, that it should be based out of an actual ecclesial structure that have to do with people who are there and gathered and encouraging and working together and mobilized to reach other people. There are ways of framing Schuller's own ministry in ways that sound very, very much what very conservative biblical kind of people would say this is what the church is about. I think that they actually would agree. And this is what people found over and over again in their surprise of talking with Schuller, is that they actually agreed on many of the same things, including very conservative theological positions and very conservative political positions. Mm-hmm. So when you then enter an environment like Southern California, a dynamic, growing, expanding population, and it wasn't the only one, it was part of that Sun Belt, that was expanding, then he's seeing everything else grow and expand, everything else trying to keep up with the population changes, everything else taking in new technology, everything else sort of taking in accounting practices and financial practices and accessing credit in order to expand their work. So in a way, he definitely did take on what he considered to be the best practices of Christian businessmen and being able to adopt things that were consistent with a capitalist-driven economy, because he did believe that capitalism was a God-given thing, right? That this was a great country, that this was a great economy, that its system was exactly the way things should be done, and he fell into those things. And so once you take on that logic then takes on two different faces. On the one hand, as a pastor, he pastored people with the compassion that they had to face tremendous changes and had to forge themselves into people who could compete in a highly aggressive economy, right? That they needed to make themselves to be marketable. And if they were going to survive, they needed to meet needs and to build businesses or contribute to businesses that met those needs. But then on the other hand, he actually used the same logic in his own congregation as he managed that congregation. And in managing that congregation, he was going to keep it moving. He's going to appease the customers. He's going to borrow as much as he could and grow on the basis of borrowing on the assumption that there are future people who are coming who will fund these things, and seeing everything as a source of revenue because that to him is a practical reality. So once you take a look at that, I realize that there is a lot that when you examine it, you can critique it. But I think that part of what the book accomplishes is to help you to understand Schuller's motivations and how consistent Schuller's motivations are, as bare and as plain as we can make them, because he also made them bare and plain in his writing and his speaking, to also uncover the assumptions that Christian ministries operate in today. So that's where we can sort of say, gee, that went out of control, or boy, that was off the rails, or there are a lot of different things that Schuller may not have anticipated or adequately accounted for, but there is a sense in which what he believed was truly traditional at the same time that it was innovating in the right directions, consistent with what he thought the culture required at the time. And that's where now we can step back and say, "Ooh, maybe that wasn't the best idea." But at the time, right, as he did it, and as his leaders followed him, and as thousands and thousands and thousands of pastors attended his seminars and read his material and consulted with him personally, they also resonated with it and built their ministries around that as well. And so, to the extent that Schuller may be we may consider to be off base, I think that we might see. To what extent is the Christian ministry in America fundamentally based on the same motivations and fundamentally based on the same ideas? And they may be obscured or hidden over in other ways, or they may have other language. But I think that there's something there before we simply say Schuller got it wrong. I think that it's important that we say there's a lot that Schuller was experimenting with, and he was open about it. He was open about experimenting. He wasn't secret about it. And doing so, he was ambitious. And so now we have other people who are also doing the same, and they are quite ambitious. But I think that in many ways, there isn't too much of a difference between how Schuller ran his ministry and the way in which many Christian leaders run their ministries today.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think something that struck me about the book, and y'all can correct me here if this is not accurate, but it struck me that Schuller was very much like a man of integrity and committed to the mission. Like you said, Gerardo, like he believed in what he was saying, I think. Like it struck me, it seemed like there was multiple times where, certainly it sounds like near the end, like things got a little sideways with the church family, so many church family members on the payroll.
Mm-hmm.
But like, as far as like Schuller himself, it seemed like he was like committed, giving of his own money again and again, taking out, it seemed like, if I'm remembering correctly, like personal loans to help fund the ministry endeavors. Like it seemed like he was committed, and it wasn't just like, he never struck me as like the kind of stereotypical, like, TV evangelist preacher. I don't want to name names, but, folks who seem to be just chasing, fame and status. Like it seemed like he believed in what he was saying, which I think, and I appreciate your point, like the implications today seem to be off base, but like, again, in the moment, I think it makes sense why he was doing what he was doing.
Mark can talk about this, I think, better in the sense that Mark interviewed so many people associated with the ministry, and I think can speak to their experience of Schuller directly.
Yeah, go ahead.
We interviewed, almost 40 different people out in Southern California, and then there's a few who were scattered across country. We did on phones, but I have to tell you, I think Gerardo and I entered this project pretty skeptical about Schuller and highly critical as sociologists. That tends to be what we do, and we still are. I think there's still a lot to criticize, but pretty much every single person that I interviewed just couldn't. They knew he was a flawed man. They called him an egghead, not one of the boys. That a consistory meeting with him was pretty much a monologue, and if he got bored, he sometimes should just walk to the window and stare out, and then
those are my favorite stories in the book.
Yeah, and walk out the door, and everybody would look around like, well, what do we do now? With all these flaws, though, they still found him. They loved him. They had very warm feelings about him. I would visit, would sneak around to visit him in the nursing home, and when he got out to the barbershop, there was really elaborate plans to how to stay in touch with him, because they had such warm regard for him. And these weren't just congregants who only saw him front stage. These were co-pastors and staff members and musicians who saw him in all his glory, so to speak.
And family members, Mark.
Yeah, and family members, and just tremendously warm regard. Yeah, we interviewed both, Bobby, the grandson, who is now, you can still watch Hour of Power from
Yeah,
Irvine,
I was fascinated to see that too.
and Robert A., the son, spoke with us as well, and Bobby actually told us that he saw Joel Osteen as the most direct descendant of his grandfather.
Interesting.
But he said, but Osteen is more orthodox than my grandfather.
Interesting.
But despite that, they all wanted to make sure that his legacy would be one that was cherished.
Mm-hmm. And we're proud that Richard Mao, former president of Fuller Seminary, wrote a wonderful foreword for the book. Rich Mao knew Robert Schuller personally, and he feels very sympathetic, very warm towards him, wrote a very warm foreword for the book, and he himself wrote in there, "This is the biography that Robert Schuller deserves."
Yeah,
it's great to see that there is a sympathetic portrait. I really feel for Robert Schuller and for what he was doing and what he accomplished, and I really felt in those last lines in thinking about his passing. The sadness of the ministry and comparing that with the incredible highs that he experienced, that the incredible moments where you really feel that there was this intersection between his own hopes for the church and his sense of what God wanted for the church. There were moments in his life where I think he really believed that those two had come together. But things didn't quite turn out that way. And so to really see that, empathize with that, and then seek to understand it, I think the book accomplishes that to a greater extent than maybe I even thought was possible.
Yeah, I think so. I want to spend a moment just on legacy. When we think about the legacy of Schuller from, the grand architecture. I mean, I think that's one thing that megachurches have not gotten is the grand architectural visions he had, but also, the megachurch model, the thinking about spectacle and performance. What do you all have thoughts about just like the legacy? And maybe this is also the question, like, do even similar stature pastors today understand how much their current status stems from the legacy of Schuller?
My guess is that they don't. I don't think they see the lineage in the ways that we do. We highlight in both books that as of 10 years ago, Rick Warren and Bill Hybels were probably two of the most high-profile pastors in the United States.
Right.
Now, both of their stars have fallen a bit. Hybels more than Warren.
Yeah.
But they're both disciples of Schuller. They both went to the Institute to learn from Schuller, and Hybels was so swept away that he was a mentee of Schuller. He was flying out once a month for a while. He took his entire staff out to the Leadership Institute. And so I think there's not a lot of pastors today who would draw that line from Schuller to themselves. But I think the shadows of men like Hybels and Warren, they learned so much from Schuller, right? Even Hybels kind of mimicked the Schuller's Leadership Institute with his conferences on leadership and church management. And so I think there's that Schuller's fingerprints are all over how pastors, not just megachurch pastors, but pastors of all congregational sizes, how they think about management and leadership, and how you actually do Sunday mornings. Schuller put a template out there for 40 years nonstop that this is how you do worship, and that's a lasting legacy.
hmm Well, I think we can spend a lot of time focusing on architecture, and we do because Schuller emphasized architecture.
Yeah.
But I think that there's a deeper principle that is also written in how we understand Schuller, and that is he sought for ministry to be nimble in relation to changing circumstances. Okay, and that sense of being nimble is part of why he moved away from denominational structures. Because he found them to be too slow, too deliberative. He called it an albatross. It's the word that Mark uses as a metaphor to describe Schuller's relation to understanding denominations. And so the issue of moving away from denominations was not out of a hatred of denominationalism or anything like that. Right. It was in order to allow the pastor to have executive authority to make decisions. And that also propelled a sense of authority over the governance of the church. So that even though you have, a board or an elder or those kinds of things, it's still the idea that the full-time professional pastor is the one who should be making the decisions, right? Yeah. And also the idea of how you work with money, ministry, hiring, bringing people in, arrangement. It's all about being nimble. Now, because you can take that principle as perhaps more core in many ways to his approach to church ministry and church leadership, we can see how pastors today are negotiating the need for buildings or land on the basis of whether it gives them that nimble quality that Schuller advocated. See, so there are people who are giving up their buildings. There are people who are diversifying into multiple campuses. There are people who are doing a number of different things, saying that having one big building and investing in one large structure actually puts too many assets and too many dynamics in one basket. And so if we're going to create a nimble community, a nimble leadership structure, then we may need to renegotiate whether this is the way to do it or not. And so as we look at seminaries that are selling their buildings, many churches who are only renting or going from here to there, they're accepting other kinds of challenges because they think that the challenge of investing in one piece of real estate is too high. That risk is too high. Right. So I think that there's more to read into and to engage with as you read, rather than seeing it only as the template of ministry, to see what are the things that were guiding that template and how is that then seeping into the way in which we see decisions being made even today.
Well, let's take a quick break here and let's come back with some closing questions. I want to ask this question first with you, Gerardo, and go to Mark. I'm thinking about one of the things I appreciate about the book was you kind of end the book, at least one of the final chapters, with hopefully I'm getting this name right, Hartmut Rosa, and talking about resonance. I was thinking about one of the authors and scholars I've appreciated, Andrew Root, who I think wrote about Rosa in his book, I think The Congregation in the Secular Age, if I remember.
Yeah, he sure
and
did,
talked about like the speed and the challenge being like the speed at which like we have to do in daily life, and we're no longer, things change so much. And certainly like I think that's where Schuller was exactly right with like the denominational structures. They're just slowing us down and we have to move quicker and we don't have time for all this. And so what do you want to say about resonance and this idea of the change and speed of life right now?
Well, I had the great pleasure of meeting Andy and Hartmut Rosa last year at Princeton Theological Seminary, where Andy gathered everybody together, a group of us, to talk. I was the only non-theologian there, but was able to think about these things because I had been persuaded, as we were working on the project, that maybe Hartmut Rosa had something to say. Theologians and pastoral leaders have been paying attention to Rosa because in a very intriguing way, Rosa has defined the social problem of our age, and that is the problem of acceleration. The idea that things are speeding up and they keep speeding up, and so the problem is the problem of obsolescence. Whether it's
Right.
planned obsolescence or the fact that you're trying to outpace obsolescence through constant reworking and reinnovation and going faster and accelerating yet again. He concludes that this is absolutely unsustainable. That the speed or the pace, even if you feel like you made it this year, you're still going to have to be faster next
Right.
year, right? And he makes this super clear. Andy picks this up and then redirects it for a theological or religious audience. Hartmut Rosa himself is agnostic, but he has seen how much resonance his concept of resonance has taken, because Rosa is saying that in a time when we cannot keep pace, we have to find some way of achieving a truer humanity or a fuller humanity, and that is by being able to find some deep sense of connection with things, with the environment, with nature, with ourselves, with other people. And he uses this concept of resonance as his sort of stopgap. It's just a big concept to sort of say acceleration is the problem, resonance is the solution. And Rosa himself does not necessarily believe that religion is capable of actually providing this, that religion may never actually be able to do it well. And there's too self-concerned, and they're also stuck in tradition, So Rosa himself never imagined a person like Schuller. Schuller does not fit into Rosa's conception of what religion could ever accomplish. And it's a challenge, which we discussed directly. But in its own way, there's a sense in which a lot of other people who are church leaders also say we've got to get off of the speed bandwagon and try to tap into whatever this resonance thing. In my mind, the difficulty is that many pastors mean that they can ignore social change and just rest in tradition and hope that they can achieve resonance through whatever they think they grew up with, or some cobbled together sense of tradition, like hymns or, a prayerful space or something like that. And I'm not sure that that's what Andy's saying. I don't think it's what Hartmut Rosa is saying, and it's certainly not what Schuller is saying. So because resonance may or may not be a pathway for considering how to address acceleration, I'm not sure that we can readily say that just pursuing resonance by moving back into tradition is the answer. So that's where being able to play on this, to be able to use Rosa's language for highlighting something that Schuller never needed to be explained. Right?
Yeah.
Schuller intuitively understood change was happening. You could not ignore it. That we have moved into a different societal sphere and we're never going to move backwards. Okay. But at the same time, Schuller had also an incredible optimism that worship and being in the sanctuary and church grounds and the architecture of church would provide the resonance that was possible. And we can still evaluate, well, is that true? We don't know. But we can also say, by the way, that as another part of the rest of the story is that Schuller's grounds and building were sold. It is now a part of the Archdiocese of Orange, right?
Yeah.
It's a Roman Catholic church. And that by embracing the local Vietnamese community, by creating space for the local Latino community, as well as just being the bishop's seat, right, of Roman Catholicism in the area, there is a lot of evidence of vitality. And last time I looked, they were saying something like 12,000 people attending mass services every weekend. So you can sort of say, okay, there is something that is still holding, still resonating in that place, even if it's not what Schuller intended, it is still what Schuller would rather have. So when it was being sold, and it could either be an extension campus of a local university or it could be a Roman Catholic church, Schuller expressed a desire that it remain a church. And to that extent, the building and the grounds has actually lived up to the legacy that he had hoped it would have.
Yeah, Mark, let me ask you too about that, because I think that was the most fascinating thing. And Gerardo, I'm fascinated by your point about how Schuller sort of understood residence there through the architecture and the campus, like you said. But like Gerardo mentioned it, but like Chapman University is connected to the tradition. I'm connected with the Disciples of Christ Christian Church, also I think the United Church of Christ. Mm. And if I read the book and understood correctly, like the family didn't want it to go to them because, as happens and has happened in many higher education colleges that even were associated with my tradition, like they've gone secular, and the family didn't want the risk of the campus going secular, the cathedral going secular. So Mark, like I just find this thing fascinating. Any other thoughts you have about that, the campus and that transition?
Yeah. So, for some folks, the Chapman bid was much more attractive. It was comparable in the millions of dollars, but there was also a very good opportunity for the congregation to continue to worship in the cathedral for perpetuity. Mm-hmm. And but they chose against that. Schuller described it as returning it to the mother church for it to go to be returned to go to the Roman Catholic diocese. And so to me, it's remarkable that, I grew up in roughly the same tradition. I'm Christian Reformed. Schuller is Reformed Church in America. Outsiders can't tell the difference. We're both Dutch. But it's a tradition of restraint, right? And modest church buildings, lack of drama in the service. It's, and so for him, to intuit, as Gerardo said, different forms of resonance, to me is just quite remarkable that someone from his background and with his theological preparation was the one who intuited, what about biorealism? That we're going to worship in a sanctuary where you can see God's nature, and it's going to be a spectacle because God is grand. We are going to have as grand a cathedral, right? And it's also very unreformed to call it a cathedral. And just all these flourishes and drama, but yet he also found a way to maintain his dignity. One of our favorite stories is part of the drama is the costume, right? The vestments. And one person I interviewed told us, well, that's because in the Presbyterian tradition, Reformed tradition, it's about the office, and so you don't get distracted by the person underneath and what they're wearing. Yeah. So this real noble idea, and then I think it was his son Robert A. who told us, well, my dad struggled with his weight. Yeah. But it hid girth, but he also liked to eat it between services. And so ketchup and mustard on the tie was no big deal. And so
it's funny because I've heard that before. It's true. It's practical. Yeah. It's true.
Yeah. Yeah. And so for us, it was just, connecting him with Rosa just made so much sense, in the ways that, if putting these two together, you almost think like, well, Schuller was ahead of his time for what he was doing.
Right. Well, this is such a great conversation, and unfortunately, I'm out of time. So, can I give you both an opportunity to just kind of share what other projects you have working on, and then how folks can connect with you? Gerardo, if you want to start.
Well, Mark and I are continuing in our work together with another colleague, Kevin Doherty. And we have been looking at anti-racism in churches that have been committing themselves to anti-racism, white progressive congregations who have said, look, we stand behind these issues of justice, and yet there is no playbook, there is no formula, there's no sense exactly of how to accomplish this. And so what happens in churches when they commit to anti-racism, the most progressive and almost exclusively white congregations do so. We have a contract with Oxford University Press for that book. It's been a 5-year project with $1 million of grant money from Lilly Endowment, and that is on its way towards completion in this year. So you can expect that in another year or so. In addition, there's always something going on, right, in terms of just keeping up with different commitments and service opportunities. And in terms of a little bit of presence that I have online, Blue Sky is where I'm at now. You can just look at my name, Gerardo Marti. No spaces. You should be able to find me there.
Great. Mark?
Yeah, and I just want to reiterate what an important project we think this is, that we're this anti-racism with a white progressive denomination, because, there's been a lot of academics in our field who have looked at white evangelicals and issues of race and racialization and racial justice. And so we think we're going to be in an important space for thinking about what is probably technically a white mainline Protestant denomination in the way that it functions. I also just submitted a manuscript that considers American Christians and how they think about poverty. And so that will be a 2026 book that should be out, I would think in the spring, but maybe in the fall of 2026. So American Christians and Poverty Myths, and the subtitle is Beyond the Veil of Meritocracy. So it's an interrogation of some assumptions we have about poverty in the United States. And I'm sorry to say, Loren, I am not on Blue Sky or Facebook. And so people can email me, and that's easy enough.
Come knock on his door at the office.
Yeah. Well, I look forward to reading that book and hopefully having another conversation with you all in the future. So thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate the conversation. We always leave folks with a word of peace. So may God's peace be with you.
And with you.
Thanks for joining us on the Future Christian Podcast. The Future Christian Podcast is produced by Resonate Media. We love to hear from our listeners with questions, comments, and ideas for future episodes. Visit our website at future-christian.com and find the Connect with Us form at the bottom of the page to get in touch with Martha or Loren. But before you go, do us a favor. Subscribe to the pod to leave a review. It really helps us get this out to more people. Thanks, and go in peace.